Let's talk about John Stuart Mill's conception of justice. Mill is a classic consequentialist, an advocate of utilitarianism. And many people have thought that utilitarians, and maybe even consequentialists in general, really can't have any conception of justice at all. Mill says that an act is right in proportion as it tends to promote happiness, wrong as it tends to promote the reverse of happiness. And so you might think that all that matters from a utilitarian point of view is the effect on levels of happiness, either the actual effect or, as Bentham and Mill both stressed, the tendency towards certain effects, the expected effects, you might say. And so if you think of it that way, you might say, where's justice? Do what is likely to have the best effects, and avoid the things that are likely to have negative effects, and that's all there is to say. There's no conception of rights or of justice that comes out of that. In fact, Bentham affirmed that consequence. Bentham said, talk of rights is really nonsense, and talk of natural rights, as in Locke's theory, is nonsense on stilts. But John Stuart Mill disagrees. He says, no, my teacher, Jeremy Bentham, was wrong about this. Actually, a utilitarian can talk about rights and can talk about justice. There is a connection between those two things. It's unjust to violate someone's rights. And so we can discuss that in tandem. So we can discuss rights and justice in tandem. They stand or fall together. But Mill thinks they do make good sense, and they can rest on a utilitarian foundation. He begins in an interesting way. He says, before we think about this from a theoretical point of view, let's think about some of the things that justice requires. What are some of the things that everybody considers unjust? And he begins to list them. So, let's start by thinking, what are some of the things that are unjust? It's unjust to what? Well, he says, let's look at some paradigm cases. First of all, it is unjust to violate someone's legal rights. Let's say I sign a contract. You agree to do certain work for me, I agree to pay you, and let's say half is due up front and then half is due on completion of the job. If I then, for example, say I'm not going to pay you at the end, I'm violating that person's legal rights. Or conversely, if they accept the money and they then just abscond and I never see them again, I put half up front and they just disappear, well, my legal rights have been violated. So those things are unjust. You shouldn't violate somebody's legal rights. But secondly, we can talk about moral rights. Those things that I just mentioned seem immoral as well as illegal, and indeed lots of things in the law correspond to moral requirements as well. But some moral requirements may go beyond that. It might be that there really ought to be a law of a certain kind, but there isn't. And by violating it, I'm violating a person's moral rights. People who held slaves were violating those slaves' moral rights, even if at that time and in that society, slavery was legal. And so they weren't violating a slave's legal rights, let's say, because the slave did not have legal rights under that system to freedom. But on the other hand, they were clearly violating the slave's moral rights. So there's a second category here. We can talk about violating somebody's moral rights. There are other kinds of violations that we consider unjust. Not giving people what they deserve. That seems more directly relevant to questions of distributive justice. I'm giving grades at the end of the semester, for example, and I don't give some students what they deserve. Maybe I just make a mistake. My eye goes across and looks at the wrong line in the grade book, and I take a student who should have had an A and I give them a C. Well, I'm violating a right of that person. It's not exactly a legal right. It is probably a moral right. But in addition, I'm just not giving them what they deserve. So I'm denying a person what is deserved. Something similar might happen in the context of a game. A football game, let's say, where a pass is thrown and the receiver seems to catch it, but the referee says, no, out of bounds, wasn't a catch. But then later, people look back at the film and say, but it was a catch. And maybe that made a difference in who won the game. You might have said, that deserved to be called a catch, and we deserved to win. And so being denied that seems unjust. There are other examples. Mill says, if I break faith with someone, that's to treat them unjustly. Now, it might be breaking faith in the sense of violating a legal contract, but it could just be a different kind of requirement. If I don't keep a promise, I promise you that I'll be at the meeting and then I don't show up, or I promise my students that I will post the notes and then I don't do it, or a variety of things like that. Well, gosh, those things are violations of rights too. If I make a promise, you have a right that I keep that promise to you. And I now have an obligation. If I don't keep it, it is unjust. We might say, well, that's really just under the heading of violating a moral right. And maybe it is just the same thing. But it looks like there's something quite general here. If I do not keep faith, even in the sense that there is not a legal contract or even a direct promise, but something else, you might say, I'm treating someone unjustly, even though there's nothing explicit that I'm violating. Mill has this kind of thing in mind. He says, if I knowingly and willingly create an expectation in you, and then I don't fulfill that expectation, I am breaking faith with you and I'm treating you unjustly. So, if every time I walk into the room, I give my cat a treat, and then I walk into the room and don't give the cat a treat, the cat may justifiably feel treated unjustly. Well, Mill doesn't talk about obligations to animals, but assuming that animals have the same status as people here, that would be a good case. But of course, to take a different kind of situation among people, that sort of thing happens all the time. We have certain expectations that are knowingly and willingly promulgated, that are formed, that are encouraged. And then if those are not fulfilled, we feel treated unjustly. A group of students walks into a classroom. They have certain expectations about how the professor will behave. If the professor doesn't behave in that way, they may feel treated unjustly, even if there's no legal contract that's being violated, even if there's been no explicit promise. Now, I don't want to think about all the ways in which professors might misbehave in the classroom and violate those kinds of expectations. I'll leave it to your imagination. But surely there are a host of those ways in which people can violate obligations. You might think of this just in terms of ordinary social interactions. We expect certain things when we meet people. And if somebody violates those expectations, we feel affronted. We feel treated unjustly. Even though there's been no explicit promise, we've never even met the person before. There's no legal requirement. For example, at least before the pandemic, it was common to introduce yourself to someone, to perhaps shake hands, to say, how do you do, or nice to meet you, or whatever. Mucho gusto, if you're in a Spanish-speaking country. If somebody doesn't respond that way, let's say you extend that hand of friendship, and you say, mucho gusto, or how do you do, whatever it is, and they respond with an expletive and an insult, well, you'll feel treated unjustly, even though, again, no explicit contract or promise. Mill gives other examples. It is unjust to be partial. Being partial, treating people more or less favorably, depending upon accidental characteristics of that person, that would be unjust. If I evaluate my students not on the basis of how they've actually performed in my class, but on some other criterion, then I'm showing partiality. That's unfair. My father in high school had a teacher that gave all the girls A's and all the boys B's or C's. Well, it was just because they were girls, okay? And so it's like, wait, that's showing a kind of partiality. That's wrong. That's unjust. Finally, Mill says, people often consider inequality a kind of injustice. People are treated unjustly if they're treated, in some sense, unequally. But he says, what do you mean when you say treated unequally? What is this requirement of equality? He considers various interpretations and ends up concluding that there isn't as much agreement here as you might think. He's looking for paradigm cases. And he says, these things, I think almost everyone will say, yeah, that can be a kind of injustice. But when we get to the treating people unequally or the inequality part, all of a sudden, turns out people mean different things. So he says, there's not as much agreement here as you might think. Maybe that's not a paradigm case, but something we have to think about separately. Well, contemplate these. Violating legal rights. violating moral rights, denying people what they deserve, breaking faith with people, acting partially toward people, preferring some to others on the basis of irrelevant characteristics, or we might say equivalently discriminating against people on the basis of irrelevant characteristics. All of those things are unjust. What makes justice different from other kinds of moral requirements, from other cases of morality? Mill says it's the difference between perfect obligation and imperfect obligation. That's a distinction that goes all the way back to Cicero, who himself attributes it to various Stoic thinkers who came before him. But the idea is this: a perfect obligation is perfect in the sense of being complete. The Latin there that perfect is derived from doesn't mean ideal or something like that. It means complete. And so it's fairly completely specified. It's something that is quite specific. Mill defines it this way: duties of perfect obligation are those duties in virtue of which a correlative right resides in some person or persons. Duties of imperfect obligation are those moral obligations which do not give birth to any right. The thought is that perfect obligations are fairly specific. I have to do this specific thing for that specific person. Or I have to not do this kind of thing to specific people. However, an imperfect obligation is general. Charity is usually taken as an example of this. I may have an obligation to help other people in need, but there's no particular person in need that I'm obligated to help. I may have an obligation to develop my talents, but there's no specific talent that I'm under a moral obligation to develop. Well, what is injustice then? It's a matter of violating somebody's rights, and that's a matter of violating a perfect obligation. So if we ask, what do all these things have in common? His answer is, we're violating a perfect obligation, a specific obligation to someone. Justice, Mill says, implies something which it is not only right to do and wrong not to do, but which some individual person can claim from us as his moral right. So actually that second category, violating a moral right, that is something that encompasses all the other categories. You have a moral obligation, a specific, a perfect moral obligation to respect people's legal rights, to keep faith with them, to give them what they deserve, to judge people impartially, to avoid discriminating against people. So we can define justice in terms of rights. Injustice is violating people's rights. So justice is a matter of respecting people's rights. Well, fine, but from a utilitarian point of view, what is a right? Here is where Mill's analysis gets interesting, and we ties it specifically to utilitarianism. Mill says, when we call anything a person's right, we mean that he has a valid claim on society to protect him in the possession of it, either by force of law or by that of education and opinion. So a right is something society should protect my possession of. A right is something society should protect my possession of. Now the question is, well, why should society do that? I have a right to life. So I have a right that you not murder me. You violate it if you do. Well, what does that mean, according to Mill? It means that society should protect my possession of my life. Society should protect me and prevent you, if possible, from murdering me. Why should society do that? Because murder's bad, okay? Because it has negative consequences. In other words, if we ask why society should protect my possession of my life or my property or anything else, the answer is utility. Because we are better off if society protects it. So, this principle that a right is something society should protect my possession of, and in general people's possession of, is something that itself follows from the principle of utility. Acts are right, remember, insofar as they tend to promote happiness. Well, if society protects my possession of certain things, that tends to promote happiness. And so those things are my rights. So in short, it is a consideration of utility. It is the tendency to promote happiness, in other words, that leads to rights. And it's a matter of respecting rights that leads to justice. To have a right, then, Mill says, is to have something which society ought to defend me in the possession of. If the objector goes on to ask why it ought, I can give him no other reason than general utility. He says this has a tremendous advantage, because people disagree about justice all the time, not only about what equality means, for example, and what kinds of inequality might be just or unjust, but also about retributive justice, what punishments are just. They disagree about modes of production, they disagree about distribution, what tax rates should be imposed, people disagree about that. How in general should we expect other kinds of burdens of society to be shared? All of those are things on which different cultures and different people within those cultures disagree. How do we settle those? We don't settle it through abstract philosophy, Mill says. We settle it by doing empirical investigation of the world. And indeed, later in his chapters on socialism, that is exactly what Mill does. He says, is a socialist organization of society better? Is a capitalist one better? Should free enterprise, as he thought earlier, by the way, when he wrote the Principles of Political Economy, is free enterprise the best possible system, as Adam Smith thought, and as he thought then? Or is a socialist system better? In the chapters on socialism, he goes in great detail through the kinds of empirical questions we would have to answer to determine that. He says, I can't give you a philosophical answer. I have to actually examine the empirical questions that would be, in the end, determinative of whether this organization or that organization better promotes the happiness of society. And he says, it's a complicated question. So he makes a few stabs in those chapters, but in the end it's inconclusive, because he says, look, there's a lot that we don't know, and that we would have to discover in order to determine the answer to that question. But the key point is this. These questions about justice depend on questions about rights. They depend in turn on questions about perfect obligation, and they depend on utility. It depends what society should protect my possession of. So when we think about schemes of distributive justice, and by now you might see that Mill isn't really going to give us an analysis of distributive justice, except to say we should distribute goods in such a way that it tends to promote happiness. We should distribute goods in a way that promotes the common good. There is not a huge gap here between John Stuart Mill and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The key thing is respecting the common good, promoting happiness, the happiness of the entire community. Which scheme of distribution best does that? In the end, it's an empirical question. We have to find out in practice by actually studying these systems as they're implemented.